Welcome to the Decode podcast. We talk on this podcast all things headless WordPress and modern web development. And we're back this time around with another great guest and some interesting topics to discuss. I'm Kellen Mace, and I'm joined as always by Will Johnston. How you doing, Will?
Doing fine.
And Will and I are pleased to be talking with Phil Crumm today. Phil, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast and joining us.
No problem at all. Pleasure to join both of you, Kellen, Will. Really looking forward to talking a little bit about headless and hopefully learning some things as we go too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Phil, first off for being on with us today. You are somebody who has put a lot of thought into this, I think. Like first of all, from 10up, who has for years and years and years been very influential in the WordPress space specifically. But you, as we'll dive into a bit, you have some background doing decoupled sites, and even in your role, as I understand it, advise clients on when certain approaches and architectures would be advantageous compared to when others would be, monolithic versus headless. Some of those types of discussions. And I know you've been on panels like at our Decode conference, for example. You're on a panel talking about similar topics in the past. So somebody who's put a lot of thought in this topic, and I think will make for a good conversation. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you for the kind words. This technology is
Certainly
super exciting and has a lot of possibilities, and always love taking advantage of every opportunity that I can find to talk about it, share some thoughts, and hopefully help make all of us a little bit better at what we do.
Yep. And geek out a bit.
Exactly.
That's what we're all about. So yeah, so with that, before we dive too deeply into things, can you just give folks a real brief intro, just maybe kind of who you are and what you do for work?
Absolutely. So I'm Phil Crumm. I'm 10up Senior Vice President of Marketing and Growth. So we're a number of different hats. Part of that is leading our new client strategy team, where we essentially sit down with folks who have some sort of digital problem, are looking for an agency partner, and help them figure out if 10up is the right fit, help them figure out what the right approach is. And as part of that, often work with them to evaluate different technology and architectural choices, monolithic versus headless or decoupled, being a pretty common topic that comes up these days, so that they can balance the pros and cons of each of those and hopefully find the right decision that will serve them well today and even 5-10 years in the future.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, 10up, as I understand it, I see 10up as kind of one of the trailblazers for headless. At least 10up is one of the first agencies I'm aware of that was building sites not long after like the REST API was in WordPress core. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it was TechCrunch. Was that one of yours? One of the early sites?
So the earliest decoupled site that we ever built was wamu.org. They're an NPR affiliate that's based out of Washington, D.C. I think that project kicked off in late 2015 and launched in January or February of 2016.
Oh, yeah.
That, I might have my dates wrong here. I kind of jumble things up sometimes, but I think that predated the core REST API pretty considerably. And at the time was sort of a, fly by the seat of our pants, put the plane together as we go exercise. It was very fun. It was a great project. We did some pretty interesting front-end interactive things that would have been much, much more difficult with another architectural approach. But as part of that, learned a lot about what it means to build these sites, learned a lot about what it means to build these sites well, and learned a lot about the kind of use cases where a decoupled architectures really shine compared to their monolithic architectures.
Yeah. Oh,
that's funny. I grew up in the DC area, so I used to listen to WAMU. I think it was 88.5.
And I'm sure they would love your contribution.
I'm sure they would.
Which leads to our first sponsor. No, I'm just kidding. They're not the sponsor. They might as well be, though. We've talked about it, but that's cool, Phil. So you have quite a history doing the decoupled stuff in WordPress. For that early project that you did, was it like XML RPC, or you built your own REST API that would return? I guess I shouldn't call it a REST because that assumes you're mapping things to different objects in the database and so on. But was it some kind of API that returned JSON then? that you used?
Yeah, it was a JSON API and it actually went through kind of an interesting evolution over its lifetime. So when we initially built the site, it's probably not fair to call it a RESTful API, but kind of the spirit of REST, thinking very atomically about the content on the site, making a large volume of API calls across the site to kind of fetch individual bits and pieces. So you had your menu, you had your footer, you had the content of a post. Sometimes within the content of a post, you had other things you needed to fetch, author information, sponsor information for sidebars, so on and so forth. Not a one-to-one mapping between the custom post types or the taxonomies that existed under the hood, but pretty close to it. And what we actually found as we built the site and we started running it in production is the theory of that is very interesting. And there's a nice separation of concerns there. You can even kind of imagine a world where components are responsible for their own data fetching and everything is just very, very nicely packaged up.
Right.
But there is a limit to the number of concurrent network requests that a browser can make. And it is very, very easy to exceed that limit when you build a site that way. And on the higher volume, higher traffic pages, like the homepage, like article pages, where there might be in some cases dozens of requests being made to serve the page, it actually ended up being considerably faster to just make a single monolithic API request that basically said, hey, give me everything I need to serve this page. So that was one of those things that was an interesting learning experience for us because we were very attracted to some of the architectural niceties of building things in a way that was a little bit more restful. We knew as we built it that it would come with some performance trade-off, but it's one of those things where until you get it live, until you get it in production, until you have the ability to monitor for it for a while, you're sort of just guessing academically. And it was never an exceptionally slow site. The nice thing about these decoupled architectures is unless you really make some poor architectural decisions, they tend to be pretty performant as it goes. But there were a number of things, we did kind of progressive loading where as the page content filled in, we'd replace sort of almost like a wireframe of the content of the page with the content and things like that. Kind of lengthy total time to render a page from start to the end of the rendering process. Things that weren't the absolute worst user experience, but aren't quite at that high bar that we hold ourselves to in all of our project work. That we ultimately ended up, determining that the less technically attractive approach serviced a little bit better. So there's always a balance there between the way the engineers would like to whiteboard it and the way that we ultimately are able to put something together in a way that kind of delivers that premium polished experience that we strive to create for all the clients that we work with.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's always that gap between the squeaky clean, idealized version of website compared to this is a reality. And like you said, concurrent network requests, all of a sudden, you're met with certain constraints and have to adapt, right? That's interesting. Exactly. And some things I would say for folks listening who are interested in headless WordPress stuff, even problems like that, I think have solutions nowadays that maybe weren't around when that site was built. Like I'm thinking of WP GraphQL. When I say that, like these days, if you have adopted some kind of a component architecture like React or Vue or Svelte or something, you could use fragments. So all the way down your component tree, they could specify which their data requirements in the form of fragments that ultimately get kind of combined together, and at a higher level, you make one network request that it kind of includes all of that data. So things like that, I think, can be workarounds to some of those pain points. Thankfully, we have at our disposal nowadays. Let's fast forward a few years then. So from those early days when I imagine doing like decoupled WordPress was a rarity, and the bulk of sites being architected and shipped were traditional monolithic WordPress sites. Fast forwarding a few years to now, like what would you say the percentage is of projects that that 10up works on? How many of those have a decoupled architecture compared to a more traditional one?
It's still relatively uncommon, but it is something that we explore more and more every year as a possible solution, and something that more and more is becoming more of a viable solution or even the right solution for a lot of different projects. Right now, I ballpark it at maybe 5-10% of the work that we do just by total number of clients.
Okay.
But it is worth acknowledging that some of the decoupled sites that we've built are, for large Fortune 500 brands, these sort of folks who tend to kind of lead the way in what it means to architect things well and adopt technologies relatively early on. The
Yeah.
most interesting thing, I think, is that early on, and certainly when we built the site for WAMU in 2015, 2016, and even over 2017, 2018, we were having conversations about headless architectures pretty infrequently. Granted, the majority of the folks who wanted to have those conversations with us were folks who were already excited about the benefits of that architectural decision, were folks who at least were somewhat technical and understood it at a high level. Maybe they wanted a little bit more insight into unpacking what that could mean within the specific needs of their site, that sort of thing, but they got it. Now we see a lot more what I'll call less technical buyers. So people who are still well informed, things like senior marketing stakeholders, folks who are very directionally and strategically oriented, whose real mandate is, let's build something that lasts 5 years or 10 years. We don't want to do this again next year.
Yeah.
Who are at least familiar with the concept of headless sites and are interested in learning more about it. Now, it's still not at a place, and I'm sure we'll talk about why here in a little bit, where it is a 100% easy yes for every single project, but compared to even 2 or 3 years ago is something that we can look at a lot more seriously for a lot wider cross-section of projects than we used to be able to.
Right. That's interesting. And would you say for the clients that you have worked with, would you say like it's more often it's the client coming in saying, we want a decoupled architecture for one reason or another? It might be like pulling data from multiple sources and, stitching it all together into their pre-rendered, front end pages, that kind of thing. Maybe they have something in mind and are coming in requesting that for 10up, versus 10up advising them and saying, you know what, based on the requirements of your project and the way you're describing things, we would recommend it. How much of each would you say you encounter?
It's probably a pretty even and healthy mix of both at this point.
Yeah.
A lot of the buyers who have a sophisticated enough digital strategy, digital presence, where the major benefits of a headless architecture really come to light, are already well aware of the pain points of doing things the way they are now. And very often they've already done some homework on what would it mean to solve this. And headless, be friends of headless, things like Jamstack are, kind of hot topics in marketing circles and CIO circles and CTO circles at this point.
Yeah.
There are some clients who come to us and say, we need to do this headless for one reason or another. There are also some who come to us who are, say, headless curious. They know a little bit more about it, but they still aren't quite sure what the right decision is. There are also some use cases where the status quo just frankly has a lot of momentum, and the status quo is the traditional monolithic form of building a site. And we have taken a step back and pointed out, hey, a lot of the challenges that you're facing are things that a decoupled architecture might solve, maybe with its own trade-offs. It might not be a 100% shoe and yes decision for you, but let's think about this and see, does it make sense to do today? Maybe not today, or maybe not for this project, but as part of your digital strategy somewhere else, let's open our mind a little bit. We have this new technology we think could benefit you to take advantage of it. Let's define a little bit more specifically what that looks like.
Yeah. Interesting. We've interviewed on the podcast folks who have had a wide range of answers on that. So people, working for web development agencies like yourself. One in particular, this guy Drew Baker, we had on one podcast. He said he runs an agency called Funk House, and he told us that they have gone to exclusively doing headless WordPress sites. Theirs are very like flashy, animation heavy, kind of brochureware type sites. And he described how they're building building up the data models that they need for the given site, like post types, taxonomies, metadata, whatever else. And as soon as that's in place, they kind of flip on WP GraphQL and then give it to the front end developers and say, go to town, like the whole data graph is there for you to, you know, pull from as necessary and build out your, like, you know, very nice, very, what's the word? Just a UI, a front end with a good UX and nice animations and so on. And they do that for all their sites now, which is like, just blew me away that, you know, that you can do that these days with WordPress without getting into all kinds of custom PHP and using the theme API and that kind of stuff. And then we've seen the other side of things, like we interviewed Greg Rickaby of Web Dev Studios, who says, you know, told us they have done headless projects. They have shipped those, but the bulk of it is still traditional at this point, for a couple of reasons. So anyways, with all that said, like, I'm wondering where 10up stands on some of these things. So some of the pros that we hear for doing more headless projects would be, one is the ability to easily reuse components across projects. We've heard from folks that they've adopted like Storybook, for example, and just have these kind of pre-built libraries of components they can pull from into their projects. And, you know, it makes ease of building things easier. Better user experience, just with some of the out of the box, like image components that front end libraries like Next and Gatsby and so on ship with, for one example. Another one is better developer experience. Like a lot of developers these days, it seems, are gravitating toward like component based architectures and modern JavaScript. So there's that. And that leads into hiring. You know, if you have folks who maybe they've done a boot camp and learned the basics of the web, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and now have picked up a framework on top of that, you know, that person, those types of people are in ample supply, I would say, you know, and sometimes it can be difficult. You know, we've heard from some folks to find they're very skilled PHP developers to work on traditional sites. So I'll pause there. Like, how many of those resonate with you, or what are your opinions on some of those, you know, supposed pros of doing more headless projects?
I think all of those things are true to an extent, depending on the kinds of sites that you're building, frankly, the kinds of clients that you're working with. And, you know, for us in the agency world, how sophisticated some of your tooling and solutions have become surrounding the traditional WordPress architecture. Very generally speaking, the monolithic architecture, that is, very generally speaking, we are much closer philosophically to our friends at Web Dev Studios. You know, there are particular projects where headless is a very clear fit, and, you know, we will not shy away from those projects. It is true that, you know, they are, I think, a better developer experience, or certainly an experience that a lot more engineers become excited about these days than, you know, let's build a HTML, CSS, PHP site like we've been doing for the last decade, even though there are some interesting technologies that have become available on that end too, that can mix things up a little bit and make things a little bit more exciting. But at the same time, you know, we have had the luxury of, over our decade history, being able to invest in a decent amount of tooling, a decent amount of architectural thinking, and, you know, really just a philosophy around the way that we build on top of traditional WordPress, build monolithic sites, where we're able to take advantage of some of those things too. You know, I think very, like, generally, the reasons why clients come to us for headless sites are probably pretty consistent, regardless of the market vertical, the type of business that they're in. You know, we generally build things that are a little bit bigger and more complicated than brochure sites. So we need to think more about kind of the scalability of the content platform. Not everything is going to be able to be tailor-made designed, because these are sites with, you know, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pages. But a lot of those philosophies make sense. Like, number one, there's that kind of preference towards the separation of concerns. Let's separate the content publishing layer from the front end. Sometimes that's just an architectural preference. Sometimes, particularly from enterprise clients, we see that driven by more of a security angle. They like the idea of being able to lock down that right layer, put an IP whitelist in front of it or something like that, IP approved list, and limit access to a specific number of, you know, GET request oriented endpoints, whether that's GraphQL or they're RESTful, or people who are very into that idea for very heavy componentization. You called out Storybook. Storybook is a fantastic technology. It is the way that I like building the hobby projects that I still do to be able to fiddle around with these things. The problem is, I think, that those component reuse aspirations still often tend to exceed the reality of how many components are really reusable across sites.